Whew. My life's been such a colour that it's difficult to say what I would be thinking of if I were another man at the same place. People remember the championships. They remember the wins, the tartan cap, the battles with the best drivers in the world. And I understand that. That is the part of racing people could see. But when I look back now, that is not what stays with me most. So when people ask me what racing really took from me, I do not think about the races I lost. I think about the people who never got the chance to grow old. I think about the moments when I understood just how little separated a racing driver from never coming home. I was fortunate, more fortunate than I understood at the time. I survived crashes that could have killed me. I watched friends die. I stood in a sport where losing someone on Saturday did not always stop us from racing again on Sunday. Back then, you learned to put things somewhere in your mind and keep going. You had to, but time changes the way you understand those things. There are 5 moments I still carry with me, not because they made me a better driver, because they changed the man who got out of the car. And some of them took me many years to fully understand. Let me start with Spa, because that was the day I stopped looking at danger the way I had before. The Belgian Grand Prix in 1966 was run in dreadful conditions. Spa was already one of the fastest and most unforgiving circuits in the world, and when the rain came down, it became something else entirely. I was driving the BRM early in the race. The weather became so bad that several of us went off almost at the same time. My car left the road and crashed badly. I ended up trapped inside it with the steering column pinning me in place. What frightened me most was the fuel. The tanks had ruptured and petrol was pouring into the cockpit. I was sitting in it. Now, when people hear that story today, they imagine rescue crews arriving immediately. They imagine trained marshals, proper medical equipment, fire protection, ambulances ready to move. That was not the world we were racing in. There was no proper rescue team standing there waiting for me. Graham Hill and Bob Bondurant had also crashed nearby. They came over and helped get me out of the car. Drivers were helping drivers because there really was nobody else properly equipped to do it. That stayed with me. I had survived the accident itself, but I began to understand that surviving the impact was only part of the problem. If the car had caught fire while I was trapped in there, I do not know what anyone could have done. And once I was out, things did not suddenly become professional. The medical arrangements were poor. The transportation was poor. I remember looking around and thinking that this simply could not be acceptable. You know, racing drivers understood risk. Nobody forced us into those cars. I never believed Formula One could be made completely safe. But there is a difference between accepting danger and accepting carelessness. I did not fully understand that before Spa. After Spa, that accident changed something in me. I started carrying my own medical information. I became much more serious about where ambulances were positioned, what kind of fire equipment was available, how barriers were built, and whether a circuit was prepared for the accident everybody claimed would never happen. Some people did not like that. There were people who thought talking about safety meant you were frightened. Some believed a racing driver should simply accept the conditions and get on with it. I never saw it that way again. Because once you have been sitting inside a wrecked racing car, unable to get yourself out with fuel around you, the argument becomes very simple. I was lucky, and I knew luck was not a safety system. Spa did not make me want to stop racing. It made me want racing to stop wasting lives for reasons that had nothing to do with courage. I survived that day, but over the next few years, some of the men closest to me would not. Spa changed the way I looked at danger. But 2 years later, Jim Clark changed the way I looked at survival. Jim was different. He was not just another driver on the grid. He was a friend. And he was one of those men who made the rest of us understand what natural ability really looked like. Jim had this extraordinary way of making speed look clean. Nothing seemed forced. Nothing looked dramatic. He was smooth, precise, and very rarely made the kind of mistakes people expected from a man driving that quickly. That mattered after Spa, because after what happened to me there, part of me still believed that if you were good enough, careful enough, disciplined enough, maybe you could control the danger. Jim's death changed that. On April 7th, 1968, he was killed at Hockenheim in a Formula 2 race. I still remember the shock of it. There are deaths in racing that frighten you because the accident looks terrible. And then there are deaths that frighten you because of who died. Jim was one of the very best any of us had ever seen. If it could happen to him, then none of us could pretend talent was protection. That was the part that stayed with me. I had already learned at Spa that the system could fail you. With Jim, I learned something harder. The sport itself could take the best man in the field and simply remove him from your life. There was no easy explanation that made it feel better. You could not say he was reckless. You could not say he was inexperienced. You could not say he had pushed beyond his ability. Jim Clark knew exactly what he was doing, and he was still gone. People sometimes think racing drivers of that period were fearless. We were not. We simply learned how to keep functioning with fear, sitting somewhere behind everything else. You had a race coming. You had a team depending on you. You had a car to drive. So you went back. That was how we survived, emotionally. You put the grief somewhere. You told yourself you would deal with it later. Most of the time, later never really came. Jim's death made my fight for safety feel more urgent. Before that, people could say I was reacting to my own crash. After Jim, it was harder for me to accept the idea that nothing could be changed, because this was not about making racing comfortable. It was about asking whether unnecessary danger had become part of the culture simply because people were used to it. Jim deserved better than that. So did all of us. I kept racing, of course. That was what we did. But something had changed. After Jim, I stopped believing that being one of the best gave you any special protection at all. And Jim was not the last friend I would lose. Jim's death had already changed something in me. But by 1970, another terrible truth was becoming harder to ignore. You could lose a friend, grieve for him, and still find yourself back in a racing car almost immediately. Piers Courage was one of those friends. He was talented, quick, full of life, and part of that small world we all lived in. In those days, the paddock was not as large or distant as it became later. We travelled together. We spent time together away from the circuit. Our wives knew each other. Our families crossed paths. So when someone died, it was never just a name in the results. It changed the room. At Zandvoort in 1970, Piers was killed during the Dutch Grand Prix. I do not think there is any value in describing the accident in great detail. What matters to me now is what happened afterward. The racing world kept moving. That sounds cold, but that was the reality. There were more races coming. There were contracts, teams, championships, cars waiting to be driven, and somehow you were expected to take the loss of a man you knew and put it somewhere in your mind where it would not interfere with the next time you climbed into a cockpit. We became very good at doing that. Too good, perhaps. People sometimes ask how we continued racing when so many drivers were being killed. The truth is, you could not allow yourself to think about death every time you fastened the belts. If you did, you would never be competitive. You had to separate things. There was a part of you that knew exactly how dangerous it all was, and there was the part that had to go racing. You learned to keep those two parts apart. For me, that became a kind of survival mechanism. I do not mean that we did not care, quite the opposite. But if you allowed every funeral, every hospital visit, every empty place at dinner to come into the car with you, you could not do the job. So you shut a door in your mind. Then you raced. Piers made that harder. By then, my campaign for better safety had already made me unpopular with some people. There were those who thought I complained too much. Some believed danger was simply part of the sport and that trying to change things weakened Formula One. But every time we lost another man, that argument made less sense to me. I was not trying to remove courage from racing. I was trying to remove stupidity from it. There is a difference. Piers was gone in June. Piers had been gone only a few months. Then came Jochen. That one cut differently because Jochen was not just another man I knew from the paddock. He was a close friend. Our families knew each other. We spent time together away from racing. And when it came to safety, he understood much of what I was trying to say. Jochen was very fast. Everybody knew that. But he was also living in the same world I was living in. He knew how dangerous Formula One had become. And he knew that too many people simply accepted conditions that should never have been accepted. By the time we arrived at Monza in 1970, Jochen was leading the World Championship. He was driving for Lotus, and that car could be enormously quick. But speed was only one part of what we thought about in those days. We thought about whether the car would hold together. We thought about the barriers. We thought about fire. We thought about what happened if something went wrong at 150 or 170 miles an hour. During practice on Saturday, September 5th, Jochen crashed and he did not survive. There are moments in racing when the noise seems to disappear from your memory. That was one of them. Jochen had been fighting for a world championship. Then suddenly the championship did not seem very important at all. The strange thing was that the Grand Prix still had to be run. That was normal then. A man could die on Saturday, and on Sunday the rest of us would put on our helmets and go racing again. I raced. I finished second. And people can look at a result like that now and see points, positions, championship tables. I do not remember it that way. I remember that Jochen was not there. That is the part people sometimes forget about that era. We were competitors, yes, but we were also a small group of men living with the same risks. We knew each other's wives. We knew each other's children. We sat at the same tables. Then suddenly one chair would be empty. Jochen eventually became world champion that year. The only man to win the Formula One World Championship after his death. People remember the history of that. What I remember is the man, and I remember the frustration, because Jochen understood the safety argument. He knew we could make racing better without taking away what made it racing. So when he died, it strengthened something in me. I was already unpopular in certain places for speaking out. There were promoters who did not want to hear it. There were people who believed a driver should simply accept whatever circuit was put in front of him. But after Jim, after Piers, and now Jochen, I could not pretend that silence was somehow more courageous. If anything, silence had become the easier choice. Speaking up meant criticism. It meant being called difficult. Sometimes it meant being accused of damaging the sport I loved. But I had started to see the argument differently. If we knew something was unnecessarily dangerous and did nothing about it, then we were part of the problem. Jochen never got to see many of the improvements that came later. I did, and that is something I have thought about for a very long time. I had lost friends before, but François was different. By 1973, I already knew I was going to retire. I had made that decision quietly, months earlier. I had won races, championships, and more than I ever expected when I first came into Formula One. And I believe François was ready to take my place. That is what made Watkins Glen so hard. François was not simply my teammate at Tyrrell. I had watched him develop. I had helped him where I could. We talked about the car, the circuits, the way to approach a weekend. He had become quicker, more confident, more complete. And I respected him enormously. He was also part of our life outside racing. Helen knew him well. We spent time together. Only a short time before Watkins Glen, we had been together away from the circuit. So this was not a cold professional relationship. I cared about the man. At Watkins Glen, everything was supposed to be moving toward a kind of ending. I had already secured the World Championship. The United States Grand Prix was meant to be my 100th Grand Prix start. And after that, I was going to walk away. François did not know that yet. But in my mind, the future of Tyrrell was already beginning to move toward him. Then came Saturday. During qualifying, François crashed at the S's. It was a terrible accident. I went to the scene. There are some things you do not need to describe in detail. You know immediately when something has happened that cannot be undone. François was gone. Ken Tyrrell withdrew both cars from the race. So I never made that 100th start. People have sometimes connected François' death directly to my retirement, but that is not quite right. I had already decided to stop, and somehow that makes the memory harder for me, not easier, because I was not leaving Formula One in panic. I was leaving because I felt my time had come. I thought I knew what the next chapter would look like. I would step away. François would continue. He had the speed, he had the confidence, he had reached the point where he no longer needed to be protected or guided the way he once had. I genuinely believed he had a great future ahead of him. And then in one afternoon, that future disappeared. That is the part I carried with me. Not the missing 100th start, not even the way my career ended. It was the knowledge that François had been standing at the beginning of something while I was standing at the end of something, and only one of us got to leave the sport alive. By then, I had already spent years arguing that motor racing did not have to accept death as casually as it had before. People sometimes thought I was trying to make racing soft. I never wanted that. I knew exactly what the sport was. I loved it. But loving something does not mean accepting everything it does to people. François reminded me of that in the hardest possible way. I had been fortunate enough to reach the point where I could choose when to stop. He never got that choice. People ask me sometimes if racing was worth it. I do not think there is a simple answer to that. Racing gave me a life I could never have imagined. It gave me championships, friendships, opportunities, and memories that stayed with me long after I stopped driving. But it took things too. It took friends. It took innocence. And it taught me much earlier than I would have liked that being talented or successful did not make a man safe. When I was young, I thought surviving was just part of the job. You got through one race, then you went to the next one. I understand it differently now. Growing old is something I never really thought about when I was racing. But when you have watched so many good men disappear, age begins to feel less like a number and more like a privilege. I was fortunate enough to walk away. Many of my friends were not. And after all these years, that may be the part of racing I understand most clearly.